If the eclipse happened a week ago, why does everything still feel so different? Why did this past weekend feel unusually quiet, like a pause in momentum, and then this week began with more clarity in some areas, but less certainty about where to go next? I don't think it was simply an energetic hangover from the eclipse. I think it was a very important part of what this eclipse was actually setting into motion. If you're new here, I'm Katya. I've worked closely with people for more than a decade during periods of deep internal change. And in this video, I'm going to clarify 3 things. First, why everything has felt so different since the eclipse. Second, what this strangely quiet pause has actually been doing. And third, what we're now being asked to do with the clarity that emerged from it. And in my opinion, that third piece is probably the most important question in front of us right now. So stick with me to the end for that. And for now, let's look at what has just unfolded. The August 12th solar eclipse happened right as we entered this new Leo Aquarius nodal cycle that astrologers everywhere have been talking about, which is kind of like receiving a brand new collective assignment. So it wasn't simply another new moon or even an isolated eclipse. It arrived right at the beginning of a much larger evolutionary conversation about who we have been, what we have been expressing, and what has been driving that expression, and what all of it is ultimately for. Eclipses, by their nature, interrupt. Think about it. For a brief moment, the usual source of light disappears, and symbolically, something very similar was happening inside us. In the days after this eclipse, something we were used to orienting ourselves around probably became less available. Whether that was your usual motivation, your schedule, a role or a project, or even other people or other people's needs. That momentum that typically tells us where we need to put our focus next got interrupted. When that happens, it can feel disorienting, and the mind can quickly interpret it as a loss of direction. But when momentum stops like it just did, what disappears isn't necessarily our direction. It's the noise around our direction. And that's where the days after this eclipse became especially interesting to me. As we moved through the weekend and into this week, there was a noticeable tension building that many of us felt like a strong urge for movement again, to take action, while at the same time feeling like the most obvious path forward was somehow dissolving. So you may have noticed something that felt quite contradictory. You could feel something had changed. You may have even seen certain things more clearly. But the moment you tried to force yourself into immediate action, things became blurry again, or they felt less stable than you remember them. And that moment right there is the first one that I am suggesting we pay attention to, because most of us have been trained to associate momentum with progress. Like, if I'm moving, I'm progressing. If I'm producing, I'm in alignment. If I'm motivated, well, of course I'm going in the right direction. But what if momentum is sometimes the very thing preventing you from noticing that the underlying direction or your most next aligned step has actually changed? Monday delivered that particular contradiction perfectly. On one hand, you may have felt a palpable tension between wanting to know what you're doing and wanting to regain movement in that direction, and at the same time, feeling your certainty about that path somehow slipping. But there was also another more supportive energetic theme that was at play, that was helping us recognize what had become clear and feeling like we needed to actually take this seriously. Not to force an answer, but to slow down long enough to recognize the answer. It's kind of like driving your car. Okay, you've got the radio on, so there is music playing. The GPS is talking. There's maybe sound of moving traffic from outside. Maybe someone is speaking beside you. And underneath all of that, there is this faint sound coming from the car. It's been there for a while, and you're trying to tell exactly what it is, but you can't quite hear it. So you pull over, you turn off the engine, you turn off the radio, and suddenly it becomes obvious. So the sound itself isn't new. You can simply hear it more clearly now because all the competing noise on top of it has disappeared. And that's kind of how the last several days have been functioning for us. The quiet we experienced wasn't empty. It was showing us what the noise of our old momentum had been making hard to hear. And that's why I wouldn't automatically interpret wanting less input or more solitude, more rest, or simply less engagement with things that you normally would care about to be something going wrong. So often, a period of recalibration can look incredibly ordinary. Not like a big breakthrough. You simply notice, I don't want fill in the blank quite so much anymore. It doesn't fit the same way. It feels like you're less willing to override something, or something that you've been trying to discern suddenly becomes really clear. And this is where that Leo Aquarius axis that astrologers have been talking about has been really helpful, because it's causing us to ask some really important questions like, what is actually driving your expression now? What's driving your momentum? Is this still alive in me, or have I simply become really good at performing it? Is this genuinely where I want my energy to go, or is it just where my momentum has been going up till now? Am I continuing this because it feels true, because it feels fully aligned with who I am? Or am I continuing just because that's what I did before? And those can look really, I would say, almost identical on the outside, but they feel very, very different internally. And this is one of the larger purposes of what we have just moved through. Instead of it being about releasing something, which a lot of eclipses often bring, this phase has been more about separation. Separating your true signal, that inner knowing within you, from old momentum, old patterns. Helping us discern between genuine desire and habitual activation, between what you know and what you can feel, and what you've been repeating, between what actually belongs in your next chapter and what you've simply become really good at carrying. And as those awarenesses start surfacing, it can initially feel like less urgency, less certainty, even less interest, or less willing to force. But less isn't always a bad thing. Quite often, less is what finally makes it possible to perceive and discern accurately. And now as we move into August 19th, things begin to shift again. We are reaching the first quarter of this eclipse cycle itself, which means the quiet isn't necessarily inviting us to stay still anymore. It's inviting us to ask ourselves, what are you going to do with what you heard when that usual momentum slowed or things got quiet? And that's the big question. But it's not about trying to figure out exactly what comes next. That could still feel a bit premature. I know it does for me. But we're not being asked to remain indefinitely inside the pause either. What we are starting to feel called to is to seriously consider what we're going to do with what became clear during that pause. And that creates an interesting choice point. One impulse says, okay, the pause is over. It's time to get things moving again. So catch up, answer everything, reopen the loops, return to the old rhythms so you can feel oriented again. But there's another impulse, a quieter, more deliberate one that sounds kind of like, Okay, wait, something just changed. Before I move again, I need to know what actually feels aligned to move with now. So the choice isn't really between action and inaction at this point. It's between returning automatically to the old momentum, to your old routine, or allowing your next movement to come from what actually became clear while the momentum was paused. To do that means being okay with letting action come after discernment instead of using action to bypass discernment. That's the point we are moving through right now. So here's the practice I want to give you today. Choose one area of your life that has felt subtly different since last week. It could be your work, a relationship, a responsibility. It could be your spiritual life or your body or something you're creating. Just pick one thing and ask yourself these two questions. The first one is, looking back over the past week, what became clear or easier to hear while things got quieter? Where did you feel relief? What suddenly simplified? Just notice. And now, as you're noticing, where did your mind immediately start defending the old way or the old routine? Where did you suddenly feel pressure? What did you already know or you could sense before perhaps the stories began? And just notice what you notice. And then, now we're moving into this next phase, so I would ask the second question, which is, what is one thing I would change about my current direction if I was willing to stand behind what became clear? Not 10 things, not a complete life plan, one thing. What is one thing you would change? Because this next phase isn't necessarily about taking big dramatic action just yet, and you can probably feel that. It's about getting you to seriously ask yourself whether you're going to allow what became clear to change anything. And that's where we are now. The eclipse interrupted something. The days afterwards gave our system room to organize. The weekend slowed things down enough so we could notice our true signal. And then Monday exposed the difference between force and true aligned direction. And now, as movement starts to become available again, the question isn't just, what am I supposed to do next? Part of you already knows that. It's, what has become unmistakably clear to me, and what would change if I actually took that awareness seriously? So as you sit with that reflection, don't rush to fill the spaciousness with action, but don't ignore what it's showing you either. Let the clarity emerge first, discern it, and then let the action come from that place. That's where you're being invited to explore next, and what the pause after last week's eclipse was actually for. To hit pause on the distortion long enough for your own process to become visible. So take those two questions with you into your week. 1, what became louder when the old momentum paused? And 2, what changes if you actually take it seriously? You don't need to answer either of those immediately, but I would take the time to seriously consider them and then answer them honestly. Because whatever is still clear after these kind of strange, quiet days could be exactly what you are being invited to bring forward now. I'd love to know what's become undeniably more clear for you during this pause and how it feels now. So leave me a comment below. And if you made it this far, thank you for listening. I will see you in the next one, and feel free to subscribe.